There is a photograph taken somewhere in the mid-1950s at one of those garden parties that the British aristocracy staged with the precision of military operations and the casualness of people who had never once worried about the bill. A woman stands near the edge of the frame, dark-haired, Argentine, jaw-droppingly beautiful in the way that makes other beautiful women instinctively straighten their posture. She is laughing at something. The person she is laughing with is not fully visible, but the body language between them tells you everything you need to know about two people who have been comfortable in each other's company for a very long time. That woman is Susan Barrantes, and the story of how she got into that photograph, into that garden, into that circle, decades before her daughter Sarah Ferguson walked down the aisle of Westminster Abbey in a dress that the entire world watched, is one of the most extraordinary backstories in the history of the British royal family. A story that almost nobody tells. Because once Sarah became famous, Susan became a footnote, and footnotes, it turns out, sometimes contain the most interesting sentences in the book. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The girl from Buenos Aires. Susan Mary Wright was born on March 27, 1937, in Argentina, to a family that had the particular quality of seeming ordinary from the outside and being considerably more complicated once you looked past the surface. Her father, Don Wright, was a British-born businessman who had made his way to South America in the manner of many ambitious Englishmen of his generation, chasing opportunities that the old country, still organized around class and connection in ways that rewarded the already arrived, did not always make available to people who were merely clever and energetic. Argentina in the 1930s was a place of genuine possibility for men like Don Wright. The country was wealthy by South American standards, politically volatile in ways that had not yet curdled into the violence of later decades, and socially organized around a small Anglo-Argentine community that maintained its Britishness with an almost aggressive thoroughness. They drank tea at the right hours, they played polo on weekends, they sent their children to schools that taught the English curriculum as though Buenos Aires were a particularly warm suburb of Hampshire. The community was tight, self-referential, proud of its particular double identity, and deeply suspicious of anything that threatened the coherence of the life it had built so carefully, so far from the country it still considered home. Susan's mother, Doris, was a woman of Irish descent whose family had made the journey to Argentina in an earlier generation. The combination of English father and Irish-Argentine mother gave Susan a childhood that moved between cultures without fully settling into any single one. She spoke English at home and Spanish in the streets. She attended an English-language school and played with children whose parents came from a dozen different European countries, all of them building their versions of European life in a city that was, at that point, one of the most cosmopolitan on Earth. Buenos Aires, in the late 1940s, when Susan was passing through her formative years, was a city of grand boulevards and opera houses and restaurants that stayed open until 3 in the morning. It was a city with genuine cultural ambition, a city that took itself seriously in the way that places do when they have decided they belong among the great capitals of the world. The architecture along the Avenida de Mayo borrowed from Paris, the cafes borrowed from Vienna, the polo borrowed from England and then surpassed it entirely, which is what happens when an import finds soil that suits it better than its country of origin ever did. Susan grew up tall, dark-haired, with a quality that people who met her consistently described in terms that came back to the same word, presence. She was not simply pretty, though she was that. She had the kind of face that made photographers instinctively reach for their cameras and then pause, uncertain whether the camera could actually capture what they were seeing. In the Anglo-Argentine world of the 1950s, a young woman with those qualities and that family background was moving in a social circuit that was small enough for everyone to know everyone and connected enough to the British world that invitations occasionally arrived from the other side of the Atlantic. Her father, Don, was a man who understood the social mathematics of the Anglo-Argentine community with precision. He had built his business through relationships, through the cultivation of the right connections in the right rooms, and he had an instinct about which rooms were the right ones that he passed on to his daughter more through example than through instruction. Susan watched her father work a social gathering from the time she was young enough to be taken to them, and what she learned was not the performance of charm but the real thing, which is sustained interest in the people you are talking to and the memory to prove that the interest is genuine. The polo connection matters here, and it matters enormously, so it is worth understanding what polo actually meant in mid-century Anglo-Argentine society. It was not simply a sport, it was a social system. The polo grounds of Argentina were where the British and Argentine aristocracies met on equal terms, where deals were made and friendships formed and marriages eventually arranged, where young men showed what they were made of in the only way that this particular world fully respected, which was on horseback at speed with a mallet in one hand and the expectation of courage in the other. The Wright family moved in polo circles. Don Wright understood the game's social function perfectly well and made sure that his family was positioned correctly within it. Susan learned to ride early and well. This was not optional in the world she grew up in. It was as basic as learning to read. A girl who could not ride was a girl who could not fully participate in the social life of the Anglo-Argentine community. And Don Wright was not raising a daughter who would be excluded from anything. Susan took to horses with the ease that some people have with languages, absorbing the skill so completely that it stopped being something she did and became simply part of who she was. She could assess a horse's quality in the first 30 seconds of watching it move. She could sit on an animal that was misbehaving and bring it back to order without drama, which is the real test of a rider. Not the ease on a cooperative horse, but the steadiness on a difficult one. She would carry that quality for the rest of her life. Horses were, in the most literal sense, what connected her world to the royal world, first indirectly, then directly, and eventually with a closeness that the history books have consistently underplayed. By her late teens, Susan Wright was one of the more striking figures in the Anglo-Argentine social world. She had the riding, she had the looks, she had the particular social fluency that comes from growing up in a household where the social life is taken seriously and the skills required to maintain it are taught without being named as skills. She spoke with the ease of someone who had never been shy and the precision of someone who had learned early that saying the right thing at the right moment was worth considerably more than saying many things carelessly. The education she received was the education of a girl from the Anglo-Argentine community, which meant English in its curriculum, and Argentine in its surroundings and genuinely bilingual in its daily texture. She read the books that English girls read. She learned the history that the English curriculum required. She also absorbed, through the Buenos Aires streets and the Argentine households she moved through, a different set of references, a different understanding of how people organized their social lives, a different relationship to formality. The English approach to social life is organized around the careful management of distance. The Argentine approach is organized around its reduction. Susan learned both and could move between them with a fluidity that people who had grown up in only one tradition found genuinely surprising. She was also, by the time she reached her late teens, someone who had developed the kind of opinions that young women in her world were not always encouraged to develop and hold. She had opinions about horses, which was acceptable. She had opinions about people and situations and the choices that the people around her were making, which was less automatically acceptable in a social world that preferred its young women to be decorative and agreeable. She expressed these opinions in the way of someone who has learned that the expression of opinion is a social skill requiring calibration, that the right opinion at the right moment is a contribution, and the wrong one at the wrong moment is a problem. She calibrated well. She always had. The world she was preparing to enter was the world of the international polo circuit, which in the early 1950s was one of the more genuinely international social worlds that existed. The players moved between Argentina and Britain and America and Australia with the regularity of a traveling circus, and the social world that surrounded the players moved with them. Wives and girlfriends and the daughters of club officials and horse breeders, and the general category of well-turned-out young women who attached themselves to sporting social worlds in every era. Susan was going to be in that world. The only question was on what terms, and Susan had a clear enough sense of herself by her late teens to have views about the terms she was prepared to accept. the polo circuit, and the prince. To understand how Susan Wright ended up in the same social orbit as Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, you need to understand something about Philip himself that the official version of his life tends to gloss over. Philip was a man of genuine and consuming physical enthusiasms. He was competitive in the way that people are when they have spent their formative years without the security that wealth provides, and have learned that the only reliable currency is performance. He had grown up scattered across Europe, raised by relatives after his family's displacement from Greece in 1922, educated at Gordonstoun in Scotland under conditions that were designed to produce toughness and frequently produced something closer to emotional austerity. He emerged from that formation as someone who threw himself at physical challenges with an intensity that the more comfortable men around him sometimes found exhausting. He was not interested in doing things halfway. He was not interested in participating at the level of someone who takes up a sport for the social connections it provides. When Philip committed to something physical, he committed to mastery, and the road to mastery was one he was prepared to travel at whatever pace was required. Polo was one of those challenges. Philip took up the game seriously in the late 1940s, after the war and after his marriage to Princess Elizabeth, when the demands of his new position were still finding their shape, and the polo grounds offered him what the palace could not: the complete absorption of physical effort, the specific companionship of people who were there because they loved the game rather than because of what he represented, and the democratic quality that serious sport has of rewarding only what you can actually do on the field. He became genuinely good at it, which is a harder thing than it sounds. Polo is not a sport that rewards casual participation. It requires years of dedicated practice, a physical relationship with horses that goes well beyond competence, and a kind of aggressive spatial intelligence, the ability to process the positions of 8 horses and 8 riders simultaneously while moving at 30 miles an hour and making decisions in fractions of seconds that not everyone possesses. Philip possessed all of these things, and he pursued the game with the same methodical intensity he brought to everything else. By the early 1950s, he was one of the better polo players among the British aristocracy, good enough to be taken seriously by players who cared about the quality of the game rather than the status of the participants. His connection to the game brought him into contact with the international polo circuit, which meant, inevitably, Argentina. The Argentine polo players were the best in the world. They had been for decades, and they would continue to be. The combination of the country's horse culture, its vast grassland geography, and the social organization of the Anglo-Argentine elite around the game had produced generations of players of extraordinary quality, men who rode as though the horse and the rider were a single organism, which is the only way to play the game at its highest level. When the best Argentine players came to Britain, they moved in the same circles as Philip. When British players and their families went to Argentina, they moved in the circles that included the Wrights. Susan Wright was 17 or 18 when she first appears in accounts that place her in the same social context as Philip's extended circle. She was not at that point someone who would have been introduced to the Duke of Edinburgh directly. The hierarchy of those gatherings was precise, and a teenage girl from a respectable but not grand Anglo-Argentine family was several social tiers below the level at which Philip operated. But the world she moved in was the world adjacent to his, and in the Argentine polo community, adjacent worlds had a way of overlapping with a frequency that turned adjacency over time into something closer to familiarity. What happened over the following years through the mid and late 1950s was a gradual social elevation that was partly the result of Susan's own qualities and partly the result of the man she married. In 1956, Susan Wright married Ronald Ferguson, and the marriage changed everything about her social positioning, though not in the way that either of them could have anticipated at the time. Ronald Ferguson was a British Army officer, a major in the Life Guards, and a polo player of serious quality. He came from a family with genuine connections to the British establishment, connections that went deeper and ran longer than mere social ambition could create. The Fergusons had a history with the polo world, with the military world, and with the aristocratic world that gave Ronald a natural ease in those environments. He was not a grand figure in any public sense. He was not famous and had no particular desire to be. But he moved through the upper levels of British social life, with the confidence of someone who had always belonged there, and his marriage to Susan placed her squarely inside that world, in a way that her Anglo-Argentine background alone would not have achieved. The couple settled partly in Britain and partly maintained connections to Argentina, which gave Susan a social range that was unusual for a woman of her generation. She was comfortable in Buenos Aires and comfortable in Hampshire. She could talk polo with Argentine ranchers and have dinner in the same week with people who had known the royal family for generations. The combination was, in the social mathematics of that world, an extremely valuable thing to be. It was through Ronald's polo connections, through the web of relationships that the game generated among the British military and aristocratic world, that Susan Ferguson began to appear in the same social gatherings as Philip, not as his equal, and not as someone he particularly singled out in the early years, but as a face that became familiar, as a woman who was always there, at the right events, saying the right things, riding well, laughing easily, and making the kind of impression that sticks without demanding attention. The specific quality of Susan's riding was something that Philip noticed, because Philip noticed that quality in everyone. He could assess a rider the way a conductor can assess a musician, in seconds and with a precision that the untrained eye cannot quite explain but recognizes as real. Susan on a horse was someone who belonged on a horse, and in Philip's world, that was a form of identity that carried genuine weight. Philip noticed Susan Ferguson. This is not a minor observation. Philip was not a man who noticed many people easily. He had a reputation, well-deserved by most accounts, for a directness that bordered on abrasiveness, for an impatience with fools that expressed itself in ways that the fools found memorable, and for a general skepticism about people who had not earned his regard through some form of genuine achievement. Susan had earned his regard through the most reliable currency in his world, which was horsemanship, and through the secondary but also genuine currency of being a person who said what she meant without managing it through layers of social calculation. She was direct in a way that women in his immediate circle were often not. The deference that people showed Philip could be suffocating, and he was well aware of it. Susan did not perform deference. She was respectful without being reverential, and she had opinions about horses and polo and the Argentine players who had been dominating the international game that were worth hearing, which in Philip's estimation counted for a great deal. She also had a way of being funny that did not require anyone's permission, not at his expense, which would have been ill-judged, but in the general direction of the absurdities that social life produces, which Philip found welcome in a world that took itself very seriously indeed. The friendship, if it can be called that, between Susan Ferguson and the Duke of Edinburgh was never the kind of relationship that generates scandal or demands explanation. It was something quieter and in some ways more interesting, a connection built on a shared world, on mutual respect within that world, and on the particular ease that develops between two people who have been in the same rooms often enough that the formality has worn away without either of them noticing it happen. Ronald Ferguson and the life they built. Ronald Ferguson is one of those figures in British social history who spent decades being slightly more important than he appeared, and then, in the late stages of his public life, became considerably more famous than he would have preferred. For most of the years of his marriage to Susan, he was known primarily within the polo world, where his reputation was substantial, and within the military establishment, where he rose to the rank of major and served with the lifeguards in a career that was respected without being spectacular. He was the kind of man who was invaluable in supporting roles and would have been miscast in a leading one. He had judgment, loyalty, a gift for the practical management of complex situations, and a temperament that remained steady under pressure. These are not trivial qualities. They are in fact the qualities that make organizations function, that allow the people in prominent positions to perform well because the infrastructure around them is being managed by someone who is good at managing infrastructure without needing to be credited for it. What Ronald had, beyond his military career and his polo playing, was a gift for friendship. He was a man who maintained relationships with extraordinary consistency, who remembered birthdays and kept in touch across years and distances, who showed up when showing up mattered. In a social world organized around networking without ever using that word, Ronald Ferguson was extraordinarily good at what networking actually requires, which is genuine warmth sustained over time. People liked him. More than that, people trusted him. The combination made him an invaluable figure in the polo world, and it eventually made him something even more significant. In 1964, Ronald was appointed as polo manager to Prince Philip. The role was not a grand one by the standards of royal appointments. It was essentially what it sounds like, someone who managed the logistics and organization of Philip's polo commitments, who dealt with the horses and the schedules and the thousand practical details that a man of Philip's status could not and should not be dealing with himself. Which horses were traveling to which events, which players were available for which matches, the conditioning schedules, the veterinary arrangements, the communication with other polo clubs and players that kept the whole operation running smoothly. But the closeness that the role required, the daily contact, the shared hours at polo grounds across Britain and beyond, created a relationship between Ronald Ferguson and Prince Philip that went well past the professional. Philip trusted Ronald in the way that powerful men trust the people who serve them, without ever making the service feel like servitude. Ronald was competent, discreet, cheerful, and entirely uninterested in trading on his proximity to the Duke of Edinburgh for social advancement. He did his job because he loved the sport and he liked the man, and Philip understood that and valued it accordingly. There is a specific kind of loyalty that develops between men through shared physical activity, through the hours of preparation and competition, and the particular honesty that sport imposes on the people who take it seriously. You cannot fake fitness. You cannot fake courage on a polo ground. You can manage your presentation in a boardroom or a drawing room in ways that conceal your actual quality, but not on a horse at speed with 7 other riders watching. Philip and Ronald had spent years in that environment, and the respect between them was grounded in the specific knowledge that that environment produces. Ronald also understood something about Philip that not many people in Philip's world understood, that the Duke of Edinburgh's most genuine self was the self that appeared on a polo ground or a sailing boat or in the cockpit of an aircraft, the physical self, the self that was operating rather than representing. Philip found the representing dimension of his life necessary and accepted it with the pragmatism of someone who has made a decision and is not going to spend his remaining years regretting it. But the operating dimension was where he was most comfortable and most himself, and Ronald's job put him squarely in that dimension, which meant that the Ronald who worked with Philip on a daily basis was dealing with a less managed and more genuine version of Philip than the version most of the world encountered. This mattered to their relationship. Philip trusted people who had seen the unmanaged version of him and continued to show up without making a production of the privilege. Ronald showed up, did his job, and kept his mouth entirely shut about anything that was not strictly his business, which in the polo world of that era meant keeping his mouth shut about a great deal. The discretion was not performed, it was simply how Ronald was, and Philip recognized it as such. What this meant for Susan was that her already established familiarity with Philip's social world deepened considerably. She was the wife of the man who managed Philip's polo life. That gave her a specific and genuine relationship to the royal circle that was different in character from the vague social adjacency of her earlier years. She was not simply someone who appeared at the same events. She was someone connected, through her husband's daily work, to the fabric of Philip's sporting life. Conversations that Ronald had with Philip during a training session on Tuesday would sometimes continue over dinner at the Ferguson house on Wednesday, and Susan was present at that dinner, contributing and listening and being entirely herself in the way she had always been. The Ferguson household at Dummerdown Farm ran according to a rhythm that was organized primarily around outdoor life. There were horses to attend to. There were the constant logistics of a family whose social life intersected regularly with events across southern England and beyond. There were the children, whose needs were real and present and not to be subordinated entirely to the professional and social demands that Ronald's position generated. Susan managed all of this with the practical efficiency of someone who had learned from her mother's household in Buenos Aires that a house full of activity is better managed through system than through anxiety. She employed help as people in their social position did. She could not have run the household without it, given the scale of what the household was required to accommodate. But she was not someone who managed from a distance. She was present in the management of her own household, in the specific way of someone who knows that the quality of a house reflects the quality of the attention given to it, and who gives that attention consistently rather than sporadically. Dummer Down Farm under Susan's management was a place that people wanted to be, that had the quality of houses that are genuinely inhabited rather than maintained as showpieces, where the food was good and the company was better and the horses in the paddock were always worth looking at. The Ferguson marriage produced 2 children, Jane, born in 1957, and Sarah, born on October 15, 1959. Both girls grew up in a household that moved between the English countryside and the Argentina that their mother had never fully left behind. They were educated in England, which was not a choice but a given in the world their parents inhabited, because the English educational system was the one that would open the right doors later, and Ronald and Susan both understood which doors needed to be open. But their summers and their understanding of horses and their sense of themselves as people who belonged to more than one world came, in no small part, from Susan and from the Argentine relatives and friends who remained part of her life. The family home was at Dummer Down Farm in Hampshire. The farm was the kind of place that English country life produced in abundance in that era, comfortable without ostentation, organized around outdoor life, full of dogs and riding gear and the general productive disorder of a household that was always either preparing for some outdoor activity or recovering from one. It was not a grand house. The Fergusons were not grand people in the financial sense. Ronald's military salary and his polo-related income were sufficient but not lavish, and the family lived accordingly, which meant well but without extravagance. What the house had, and what money alone cannot buy, was a constant flow of interesting visitors, people connected to the polo world, to the military world, to the social circles that intersected with the royal establishment, people who came for weekends and stayed for meals and talked about horses and sport and the particular gossip of a world that was small enough that everyone in it had opinions about everyone else's performance and conduct and choices. The Ferguson girls grew up overhearing conversations that most children never get near. They absorbed, without consciously realizing they were absorbing it, the rhythms and references of a world that would become, for one of them, her actual world in adulthood. Sarah, in particular, absorbed her mother's quality of physical confidence. The ease with large animals and open spaces, the willingness to take risks that horsewomen develop when the horses are big and the courses are demanding. She also absorbed something of her mother's social ease, though Sarah's version of it came wrapped in a boisterousness that Susan had never quite possessed. Where Susan's charm was quiet and precise, operating below the surface of social situations rather than on top of them, Sarah's was loud and joyful and entirely without self-consciousness. The difference was temperamental. The underlying confidence was the same, and it came from the same source. Jane, the older daughter, took a different shape from the same material. She was steadier, less flamboyant, more drawn to the private life that the English countryside enabled than to the social performance that the polo world celebrated. The 2 girls were shaped by the same household and the same parents and the same horses, and they became entirely different people, which is what households and parents and horses always produce when they are honest about it. The marriage that was and the marriage that ended. Susan Ferguson was, by all accounts of people who knew her during the years of her first marriage, an engaged and present mother when the structure of her life allowed for it. She rode with her daughters. She took them to Argentina. She taught them, through example rather than instruction, the kind of physical confidence that she herself had learned from a childhood spent between 2 very different versions of what life could look like. She was not a woman given to excessive sentiment, and she was not a woman who expressed love primarily through words. She expressed it through doing, through being there, through the shared activities that in the world she came from were the primary language of connection. The lesson she gave her daughters was not spoken. It was demonstrated in the way she sat on a difficult horse without fear, in the way she walked into a room full of strangers and within 20 minutes was laughing with 3 of them. These were things you learned by watching, and both girls watched. The marriage to Ronald Ferguson lasted 19 years. What ended it was not dramatic in the way that public marriage failures often are. There was no single explosion, no revelation that changed everything overnight. There was instead the slow accumulation of two people growing in different directions, of a life that had been built around shared activities and mutual social positioning, discovering that the emotional architecture underneath had not kept pace with the external structure above it. Ronald was, in his domestic life, a man whose primary commitments ran through his professional world. The polo, the military, the relationships those two worlds required him to maintain. This was not unusual for men of his class and generation. It was, in fact, entirely expected. But expected is not the same as sufficient, and Susan was a woman who had always known the difference between what the world expected of her and what she herself needed, and she had always eventually chosen the latter. In 1974, Susan met Hector Barrantes. The meeting was on a polo ground because of course it was. The entire geography of Susan's life ran through polo grounds, and the most consequential meetings of her life happened on or near them, with the regularity of a pattern that seems in retrospect almost too neat to be accidental. Hector Barrantes was Argentine, a polo player of genuine quality, and a man whose physical presence was the kind that makes rooms reorganize themselves subtly when he walks into them. He was dark, compact, with the particular ease in his own body that exceptional horsemen develop over years of moving with animals that weigh 10 times what they do. He had played at a high level for years and had the reputation that comes with that, a name known in the polo world before he was introduced, a quality of play that people who had seen it still talked about. He was also charming in the specifically Argentine way that is different from the English way, more direct, warmer on the surface, less guarded about expressing enthusiasm or admiration. He looked at Susan Wright Ferguson and made very little effort to conceal the fact that he found her extraordinary. Not the performance of finding her extraordinary, not the strategic deployment of flattery that the English social world had trained her to recognize and discount. The real thing, expressed with a straightforwardness that was either disarming or presumptuous depending on how you received it. Susan received it as the former. She was 37 years old. She had spent nearly 2 decades in a marriage that had given her daughters and a social position and a life that was genuinely good by most measures, and that had also slowly, quietly, without anyone's fault particularly, stopped being the thing she most wanted. Hector Barrantes arrived, and the contrast between what she had and what she felt in his company was stark enough that she could not ignore it. She had spent her adult life being honest in the ways that her world allowed, and being dishonest about this did not seem like a sustainable position. She did not act immediately. The world she lived in did not make acting immediately easy. Divorce in the British aristocratic adjacent social world of the mid-1970s was not the casual thing it has become subsequently. It carried weight. It reorganized relationships. It required people to choose sides in ways that nobody wanted to be forced into, and it required the woman who initiated it to absorb a particular kind of social judgment that the man almost never faced in equivalent measure. Susan understood all of this perfectly well, and she took the time that the situation required. Ronald Ferguson knew what was happening, as spouses always do, with a knowledge that precedes the words and makes the words, when they finally come, feel less like information than like confirmation. The marriage ended formally in 1974. The divorce was not acrimonious in the explosive sense. It was sad in the way that the end of long things is sad, with the particular heaviness of all the years that sit on the wrong side of the decision. Ronald kept Dumber Down Farm. The girls were 14 and 16, old enough to feel the full weight of it, young enough that the weight would take years to properly settle into whatever shape it was going to take in their lives. Susan married Hector Barrantes in 1975 and went with him to Argentina, to a ranch called El Pucará in the province of Buenos Aires that was everything the word ranch suggests: vast, beautiful, organized entirely around horses, and about as far from the English social world as geography could take a person while remaining on the same planet. She was returning in the most literal sense to the world she had come from. But she was returning as a different person, one who had spent 20 years moving through the British establishment and learning its codes, one who carried her daughter's childhoods in England as a permanent part of herself, even as she was building something new on the other side of the Atlantic. The person who arrived at El Pucara in 1975 was not the person who had left Buenos Aires in 1956. She was richer, more complicated, more aware of the full range of what a life could contain, and more certain than she had ever been about what she wanted the rest of hers to look like. What the daughters inherited. Jane Ferguson was the older of the two girls, and her response to the family's dissolution was the quieter of the two responses. She built a life that stayed deliberately out of the public eye, married a farmer, raised children, and maintained the English country life that was the stable part of her upbringing. She visited her mother in Argentina. She kept her relationships with both parents. She did not become famous, which in the particular circumstances of her family's subsequent history was not an accident but a choice, expressed not through any single dramatic decision, but through the accumulation of 1,000 small ones that consistently prioritized privacy over everything else. There is a version of wisdom in Jane's choices that is easy to miss because it is not visible in the way that its opposite is visible. She watched what happened to Sarah, and she made her own calculations about what she valued and what she was willing to risk, and the calculations came out differently. This is not a failure of courage. It is a different definition of what courage is for. Sarah did not make those choices, not because she was incapable of privacy, but because something in her temperament, the boisterous quality, the physical confidence, the genuine enjoyment of being in rooms with people and making things happen, pushed consistently in the other direction. She was 19 when her parents divorced, old enough to understand it completely, and young enough to carry it in a way that shaped her subsequent behavior in patterns she herself has described with considerable honesty in the years since. She went to work in London. She was not academically inclined in the formal sense, which is the polite way of saying that the structures of institutional education did not particularly suit a mind that worked better through activity and engagement than through sitting still and processing information in linear sequences. She attended Queen's Secretarial College, as young women of her background did, and then moved through a series of jobs in the London world of public relations and publishing and the general category of work that well-connected young women did in the late 1970s and early 1980s when they needed to be earning without being overly confined. She shared flats with friends in the way of young women of her class and generation who had been given enough social capital to navigate London, but not enough money to navigate it without working. She was funny, energetic, socially adept, and genuinely popular in the specific world of upper-class young London that she inhabited. People liked Sarah Ferguson in the unforced way that people like someone who is genuinely glad to see them, who brings warmth to a room rather than requiring the room to warm to her. She was also, through the entire period of her young adult life, someone who moved in circles that were adjacent to the royal family without being inside it. This adjacency was not something she manufactured, it was simply the arithmetic of her world. Her father's closeness to Prince Philip made the royal family a constant background presence in her awareness, names she heard from childhood, events she had some awareness of, a world that she had never been inside but that had never felt entirely foreign either, because it was a world that had been part of the texture of her upbringing in ways she had not fully catalogued. Princess Diana was a friend, and the friendship between Diana and Sarah in the early 1980s was genuine, rooted in the particular ease of two young women who had grown up in the same social orbit and found each other's company straightforwardly enjoyable. Diana had married Charles in 1981 and was by 1984 and 1985 a figure of global celebrity, and her friendship with Sarah placed Sarah within proximity of the royal world in a way that was both direct and entirely natural. Nobody engineered this. It was simply the geography of a small social world, operating as small social worlds do. The story that is usually told about Sarah Ferguson and Prince Andrew is that they met at Royal Ascot in 1985 and that the chemistry between them was immediate and obvious. This is true as far as it goes. What it omits is the degree to which the meeting was not accidental, not in the sense of having been arranged by anyone in particular, but in the sense of being the product of a social environment that had been constructed over decades. Sarah Ferguson did not walk cold into a room full of strangers and happen to catch a prince's eye. She walked into a world that her parents had spent 30 years helping to build, Alpucará, and the life Susan chose. The ranch at Alpucará was not a retreat. Susan Barrantes, as she was now, did not go to Argentina to hide from anything or to recover from the life she had left behind. She went because Hector was there, and because the horses were there, and because the particular scale of the Argentine landscape, the grassland running to every horizon without interruption, the sky that does not end, suited something in her that the carefully managed English countryside had never quite satisfied. The pampas is a landscape that rewards a specific kind of temperament. It is not subtle. It does not offer the sheltered domesticity of an English garden or the managed beauty of a Hampshire estate. It is vast and open and slightly merciless, indifferent to human preference in a way that is either liberating or terrifying depending on who is standing in it. Susan found it liberating. She had always been someone who needed space, literally and figuratively, and the pampas gave it in quantities that England simply could not match. She threw herself into the ranch with the same physical commitment she brought to everything. Alpucará under Hector and Susan became a serious polo operation, breeding and training horses that were sold to players across the polo world, including players who came from the highest levels of British social life and who therefore maintained, through their visits to Alpucará, the connection between Susan's Argentine life and the British world she had come from. The horses were the business, and the business was serious. They were not running a hobby farm for wealthy visitors. They were producing animals of genuine quality that the polo world needed and came looking for. The breeding program required knowledge, patience, and a willingness to make decisions about bloodlines and training methods, and the management of young animals that was based on experience and judgment rather than sentiment. Susan had all three. She had been around horses her entire life, which is different from knowing about horses in the way that reading produces knowing. She understood them physically, in the way of someone whose relationship with horses is expressed through her hands and her legs and her weight and her balance, rather than through language. This quality, practical and unglamorous and entirely real, made her genuinely useful in the running of the ranch rather than decorative to it. Hector respected this. The polo world was full of women who were adjacent to it through their husbands or fathers, but who were not themselves practitioners in any serious sense. Susan was not in that category. She could get on any horse at Alpucará and give a useful account of it. She could watch a young animal work and have an opinion about its prospects that was worth hearing. The ranch was a partnership in the operational sense as well as the romantic one, and that partnership was one of the things that made the marriage work as well as it did. The ranch also became a social hub for the international polo circuit. People came from Britain, from America, from across South America. The hospitality was genuine and generous in the Argentine manner, which meant meals that lasted hours and conversations that ranged freely, and no one made to feel they had stayed too long. Susan was a remarkable hostess in the specific way of someone who is genuinely interested in the people around her, rather than performing interest for social advantage. She remembered things about the people who came to Alpucará. She asked questions at their next visit that showed she had been paying attention at the last one. She made people feel that their presence was not incidental but welcome, which is the most important thing a host can make a guest feel, and the hardest thing to fake. The British visitors to Alpucará arrived with their polo bags and their particular English manner and found themselves in a world that was simultaneously familiar and entirely foreign. The polo they recognized, the horses they recognized, the conversation about the game and the players and the breeding programs was the conversation they could have had in Hampshire. But the scale of the landscape was not Hampshire, and the food was not Hampshire, and the rhythm of the days was not Hampshire, and Susan navigated the difference for them in the way that someone who has lived in both worlds can, making the unfamiliar comfortable without flattening what made it interesting. Through these visits, the connection between Alpucará and the British polo world remained alive and functional throughout the years of Susan's Argentine life. The polo world Philip moved in, and the polo world Susan had built at Alpucarra were connected by the people who traveled between them, and the people who traveled between them kept both sides informed about the other, in the way of shared communities that geography separates, but shared passion connects. What Philip made of it all. The question of what Prince Philip made of Susan's choices, the divorce from Ronald, the marriage to Hector, the departure to Argentina, is one that the historical record does not address directly. Philip was not a man who expressed personal views about other people's romantic choices, at least not in any documented way. He was not given to the kind of commentary on other people's private lives that would have been considered in his world a form of vulgarity. What can be said is that Philip maintained, throughout the period of the Ferguson marriage and the years after its end, a consistent relationship with Ronald that was not disrupted by the divorce. The polo management role continued. The professional relationship continued. Philip was not someone who required those around him to have conducted their personal lives in any particular way. He required them to do their jobs well and to behave with basic decency in their professional conduct, and Ronald met both criteria consistently. The relationship with Susan, such as it was, also survived. She continued to appear in the polo world when she came to Britain. She continued to move in the circles that both of them had inhabited for years. The specific formality of her position had changed because she was no longer the wife of Philip's polo manager but the ex-wife of Philip's polo manager. But the social world is more flexible about these things than its formality suggests, particularly when the person in question has genuine social standing of her own that does not depend on the relationship that has ended. Philip valued Susan's quality of directness. He had encountered it over years of social occasions, and it had not diminished with familiarity, which was one of the things that distinguished it from the social performances that people around him often maintained. She was the same person in the 10th year of knowing him as she had been in the first, and that consistency was, in a world where almost everyone presented a managed version of themselves in his presence, something he found genuinely refreshing. He also, it seems, respected the choice she had made, not in the sense of approving or disapproving of it, which was not a category he would have considered his business, but in the sense of understanding it. Philip was someone who had, throughout his life, placed enormous value on living in accordance with what he actually was, rather than what convention required him to be. The fact that this choice had been made much more available to him by his position than it was to most people is a separate matter. The value he placed on authenticity was real, and Susan's willingness to reorganize her life around what she actually wanted, rather than what was expected of her, was something he could recognize as a form of courage. The polo world continued to be the connective tissue of the relationship between Philip's world and Susan's. Alpucarra's horses ended up in Britain sometimes, sold to players or clubs in the international circuit. British players visited Alpucarra. The names that appeared at events in Windsor appeared at events in Buenos Aires. Susan and Philip were never going to be people who lost touch entirely, because the world they shared was too small for that, and neither of them had any reason to want to lose touch. The engagement and what it really meant. When Sarah Ferguson and Prince Andrew announced their engagement in March 1986, the public response was almost entirely focused on Sarah herself. Who was she? Where had she come from? What was she like? The tabloid press went to work on these questions with the thoroughness that only the British tabloid press can bring to bear on a topic it considers nationally important, which the romantic life of a royal prince unquestionably was. Stories appeared about Sarah's life in London, her jobs, her flat, her friends, her hair, her weight, and her laugh, in roughly equal measure and with roughly equal enthusiasm. She was photographed from every angle and described in terms that ranged from warmly admiring to faintly condescending, depending on which newspaper you were reading and what that newspaper had decided its readers wanted from a royal fiancé that week. What the coverage did not particularly pursue, at least not initially, was the question of how a woman like Susan Barrantes had come to raise a daughter who moved with such obvious ease in the royal world. The assumption was that Sarah had simply got lucky, had happened to be in the right place at the right time, had caught Andrew's eye through the happy accident of Royal Ascot and the chemistry of a specific afternoon in June 1985. The deeper story of how the social environment that made that afternoon possible had been constructed over decades was not the story the press wanted in 1986. Susan Barrantes came to Britain for the engagement announcement and for the wedding preparations, and the coverage she received during this period is instructive in what it reveals about what the press expected of a woman in her position. She was photographed. She was described as the bride's mother, as the former wife of Ronald Ferguson, as the current wife of a handsome Argentine polo player. She was described as glamorous, which she was. She was described as exotic, a word that says more about the person using it than the person it describes. She was described as controversial because the divorce and the remarriage had been noted, and because the press found it vaguely scandalous that a mother should have left England for Argentina while her daughters were teenagers. What nobody wrote about, at least not in any sustained way, was that Susan Barrantes had known Prince Philip for 30 years, that she had been a face in the polo world that Philip moved through for longer than most of the journalists now photographing her daughter had been alive. That the royal wedding of 1986 was not, from Susan's perspective, an arrival into a world she had never entered. It was a return in the most public possible form to a world she had been navigating quietly since she was a young woman in the mid-1950s. The wedding itself, on July 23, 1986, at Westminster Abbey, was everything that royal weddings are designed to be. Vast, gorgeous, organized with the military precision that the British establishment brings to occasions it considers important, and watched by a global television audience of somewhere in the region of 500 million people. Sarah wore a dress designed by Lindka Sirach, ivory silk with the Ferguson family thistle embroidered on the train, and she walked down the aisle with her father and married a prince, and the whole world watched and had opinions. The crowds that had lined the route to Westminster Abbey were enormous and enthusiastic in the way that royal occasions produce when they are genuinely popular rather than dutifully attended. Sarah was popular. She had a quality, visible even through television screens, of being someone who was having the time of her life and was not going to apologize for it, and the public responded to this with a warmth that was genuine rather than manufactured by the publicity machine. The publicity machine helped, but the warmth preceded it. Inside the Abbey, the organization of the occasion reflected decades of accumulated expertise in the staging of state events. The music was correct. The order of service was correct. The clergy were correct. The guests were seated in the hierarchical arrangement that these occasions require, the family and the heads of state and the diplomatic corps, and then, spreading outward in carefully calibrated tiers, the various categories of people whose connection to the principles had earned them a seat in the building. Susan sat in a position appropriate to the mother of the bride, which placed her within the first considerable tier of seating, close enough to see her daughter's face as she made her vows. What Susan thought during those minutes is something she did not document and that no one who was present can fully report. She was a private person about the things that mattered most to her, and her daughter's wedding was very much among those things. What the photographs show is a woman who was present with complete attention, whose composure was not the composure of someone suppressing strong feeling, but the composure of someone who has decided that the appropriate response to this moment is to be entirely in it, which is a harder thing to manage than it appears. Philip was there as the father of the groom. The photographs from that day show what photographs from any event involving two people who have known each other for 30 years and are now connected through their children's marriage show. A comfort, a familiarity, a history that does not need to be explained because both parties carry it completely. They would have spoken, the occasion required it. What they said to each other in whatever brief exchange the choreography of the day allowed is not recorded, but the quality of ease between them that appears in photographs from that day is visible to anyone who looks for it. The specific ease of people who are not meeting for the first time, but for the 100th time in circumstances that happen to be unusually consequential. After the ceremony, the reception at Buckingham Palace proceeded in the way of royal receptions, with the particular combination of grandeur and logistical management that these events require. Susan moved through it with the ease that she brought to all social occasions, which is to say she was genuinely present and genuinely interested and entirely unhurried, talking to the people who found their way to her rather than maneuvering toward the people she calculated it was useful to reach. This was always her social method, and it was effective precisely because it was not a method but a disposition. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Duke and the Years Between. The relationship between Susan Barrantes and Prince Philip across the 30 years before the wedding is one that cannot be reconstructed in full from the historical record, because the historical record in this area is incomplete by design. The British royal family does not document its informal social relationships. The polo world does not keep archives of friendship. The Argentine ranch community does not produce memoirs about who knew whom in the 1950s. What can be assembled from the accounts of people who moved in these circles, from the social documentation that exists in the form of event records and press photographs, and the occasional reference in published memoirs, is a picture of a relationship that was warm, long-standing, and genuinely mutual. Not a close friendship in the way that term is usually understood, because the formalities of Philip's position made genuine close friendship with people outside a very narrow circle structurally difficult. But something more than acquaintance, something that had the quality of relationships built through sustained shared experience in a specific world that both parties loved. Philip spent hours of his life in the polo world, and Susan spent hours of her life in the same world, and over years and decades the hours accumulated into something that required no maintenance because it had been established too thoroughly to need it. She did not have to remind him who she was. He did not have to perform interest in what she said. The familiarity was real, earned through time and through the specific trust that shared physical worlds generate between the people who inhabit them. Ronald Ferguson's role as Philip's polo manager gave the connection an institutional dimension that simple social familiarity would not have provided. Ronald's professional life and Philip's polo life were intertwined daily, which meant that the texture of Ronald's domestic world, including Susan, was something Philip had genuine awareness of. When the marriage between Ronald and Susan ended, Philip had been watching it from a position of greater proximity than most observers. He knew Ronald well enough to understand what the marriage had been and what its ending meant, without needing to have any opinion about it beyond the private recognition that marriages end and people make choices and the world continues. The specific texture of the social world they shared was the polo world in its international dimension. The players who moved between Argentina and Britain, the horses that were bred in Buenos Aires and raced at Caudray Park, the club officials and patrons, and the social infrastructure that organized itself around the game in both countries. Susan occupied this world at a specific level, not at the very top where Philip operated, but at the serious level of someone who was there because she knew the game and loved it and was genuinely part of it, not because she was attached to someone who was. Philip respected this. He was, throughout his polo career, consistently impatient with the social tourism that surrounded any sport that attracted wealthy spectators, with the people who came to be seen rather than to watch, who knew the language of the game without knowing its substance. Susan was not in that category. She had been riding and watching and talking about polo since she was a child in Buenos Aires. Her opinions were grounded, her knowledge was real, and she had, through the years at El Pucará, developed a specific expertise in the breeding and training of polo ponies that was recognized by people who knew what they were looking at. The tabloids and the trouble they made. The years between Sarah's wedding in 1986 and the formal separation in 1992 were years in which the tabloid press developed an appetite for the Ferguson family story that never quite went away. Initially, the coverage was warm, almost indulgent. Sarah was popular, funny, recognizably human in ways that the more formal presentation of other royal family members made her seem refreshingly accessible by comparison. She was photographed skiing and laughing and making faces and doing all the things that young women who are having a genuinely good time do. The public responded to the authenticity of it, even when the press occasionally suggested that the authenticity was itself a kind of problem, that a royal duchess should perhaps be somewhat less visibly human. This was the bind that Sarah could never quite escape. The qualities that made her popular were also the qualities that made her, by the standards of the institution she had joined, problematic. The coverage of Susan during this period had its own particular texture. She was presented as the glamorous Argentine grandmother, the exotic mother of the Duchess, a figure whose foreign romance and beautiful face and easy manner in grand surroundings made for appealing copy. She was photographed with Hector at polo events and at Ascot, and at the various occasions that brought her back to Britain. The coverage was not initially unkind. She made good pictures, and she behaved impeccably, and she gave the press very little to work with beyond the surface, which was more than enough. Hector was photographed alongside her, and he photographed well, dark and compact and physically assured in the way of men who spend their lives with horses. The tabloids loved the romance of it, the glamorous exile in Argentina, the beautiful woman and the polo-playing lover, the ranch under the vast Argentine sky. It was good copy, and Susan understood that it was good copy, and she gave the press nothing that would complicate it while the press was still inclined to be friendly. The coverage became more pointed as Sarah's marriage began to show the strains that would eventually produce the separation of 1992. As the stories about Andrew and Sarah's difficulties multiplied, the coverage of everyone around Sarah shifted in register. Susan was no longer just the glamorous mother. She became, in the tabloid version, the mother who had abandoned her daughters to run off to Argentina with a polo player, and the suggestion, sometimes explicit and sometimes merely implied, was that Sarah's difficulties were connected to this abandonment. This is the specific injustice of tabloid narrative logic, which requires explanation and which assigns cause according to the story it has already decided to tell, rather than according to any genuine investigation of what actually happened. Susan had not abandoned her daughters. She had made choices about her own life when her daughters were old enough to be at school, and she had maintained her relationships with them across the distance that those choices created, and the relationship between Susan and Sarah was, by the accounts of everyone who knew it, genuinely loving and genuinely present in the ways that distance allowed. The tabloid version of Susan as the absent mother served a narrative purpose that had nothing to do with Susan and everything to do with the story the press was telling about Sarah. It required a cause for Sarah's troubles, and Susan's choices provided one that was simple enough to print in a headline. Susan understood this perfectly well and found it, to the extent that she allowed herself to find anything the British tabloid press did interesting, mildly contemptible. She handled it with a composure that people who knew her described consistently as characteristic. She did not give interviews explaining herself. She did not issue statements. She did not make the kind of public gestures that are designed to manage perception and that always somehow make perceptions worse. She continued to live her life at Alpucarra with Hector, continued to come to Britain when her daughters needed her, and continued to move through the social world she had always moved through, with the ease of someone who had earned her place in it and was not going to be argued out of it by newspaper coverage. Philip watched the press coverage of the Ferguson family with the specific distaste of someone who had been observing tabloid behavior toward the people he cared about for decades. He had watched it happen to his wife and to his children and to the people around them, and he had developed a posture toward it that combined public dignity with private fury and managed, most of the time, to express primarily the former. What he made of the coverage of Susan specifically is not documented, but his general contempt for the tabloid press's treatment of the people in his world was well established and unambiguous. The royal divorce and what it cost. The separation of Sarah and Andrew was announced in March 1992. The specific events of the preceding months that led to the announcement are part of the public record in a way that requires no extensive rehearsal here, involving as they did the particular combination of private difficulty and public exposure that made the early 1990s one of the most turbulent periods in modern royal history. Sarah has written about this period with a rawness that remains striking. The isolation she felt within the royal institution, the sense of never quite belonging despite being legally and formally a member of the family, the particular loneliness of being someone whose public image had become so much larger and more fixed than her private reality, that the gap between them was a kind of permanent homelessness. She was the Duchess of York, who was not quite inside the institution she was nominally part of, the wife who was not quite at home in the household she was nominally running. She reached for her mother across the distance, and Susan reached back across the distance, which is the best that distance allows, and which is genuinely not enough when what is needed is the physical presence of the person you are reaching for. The telephone is a remarkable instrument, and it cannot hold someone when they are crying. Susan came to Britain when she could. The visits were not infrequent, because the situation with Sarah required them to be not infrequent. But the rhythm of Susan's life was at El Pucará, with Hector and the horses and the ranch, and returning to Britain for extended periods was not something the ranch could easily accommodate. She was pulled in two directions simultaneously, as parents who have built lives far from their children are always pulled when those children most need them, and neither direction could be fully honored at the expense of the other. What Susan could do and did was be completely present when she was present. The visits to Britain during the difficult period of the separation and the years leading to the divorce had a quality that the people who observed them noticed. Susan did not come to manage the situation, or to offer advice, or to navigate the press, or to manage the relationship with the palace. She came to be with her daughter, in the specific and irreducible sense of being physically present with someone you love who is going through something hard. Sarah has described her mother in terms that circle around this quality consistently, the quality of genuine presence, of being fully in the room rather than partly in the room, while partly somewhere else. Philip was navigating his own version of the family difficulty during this period. The problems were not confined to Andrew and Sarah. Charles and Diana had their own parallel crisis, announced in the same year, and the general picture of the royal family that the British public was receiving in 1992 was one that required considerable management. Philip's response to all of it was characteristically stoic, a word that is sometimes used to mean admirable and sometimes used to mean emotionally inaccessible, and in Philip's case meant something like both simultaneously. The divorce was finalized in 1996. Sarah and Andrew maintained the particular post-divorce arrangement that made them, by their own account and by the account of observers, one of the more functional former married couples in public life. They shared custody of Beatrice and Eugenie with genuine cooperation. They appeared together at events for their daughters without the performance of hostility that divorced parents sometimes inflict on their children as a form of proxy warfare. They maintained what Sarah has described as a genuine friendship, which in the circumstances of how the marriage had ended was a genuinely difficult thing to maintain and a genuinely admirable thing to have managed. Susan watched all of this from El Pucará and from the British visits that the situation continued to require. Her relationship with Andrew, the son-in-law who was now the former son-in-law, remained functional because Andrew's relationship with Sarah remained functional, and because Susan was not someone who organized her feelings about people around categories like former or current. He had been good to her daughter in the ways that he could be, and he was a good father to her grandchildren, and those facts were sufficient for Susan's purposes. Hector, the relationship between Susan and Hector Barrantes, has not received the attention it deserves in most accounts of Susan's life, which is a significant omission because Hector was the central fact of her adult life for more than 2 decades. He was not a colorful appendage to her story. He was the reason she had the story at all in its Argentine form. Hector was born in 1942, making him 5 years younger than Susan. This gap, not enormous in absolute terms, registered in the energy he brought to everything. He was physically tireless in the way of men who have spent their lives in sustained outdoor work, who have developed a relationship with physical exertion that is not the recreational relationship of someone who chooses to be active, but the fundamental relationship of someone for whom being active is simply what existing means. He rose early and worked hard and had the appetite for physical challenge that distinguished the serious polo players from the enthusiastic ones. His polo career had been genuine. He had played at a level that gave him a name in the international polo world, known to people who followed the game with the serious attention that serious players of any sport bring to watching their sport played at the highest level. He had not been the most famous Argentine polo player of his generation, but he had been one of the respected ones, which in the polo world carries more weight than fame, precisely because the people doing the respecting are the people who know what they are watching. At El Pucara, his expertise was in the training and development of young horses for polo, a specific skill that combines knowledge of equine physiology and psychology with the patience to work with animals on the long time scale that their development requires, and the judgment to know when to push and when to wait. He was exceptionally good at it. The horses that came out of El Pucara's training program had a reputation that preceded them when they came to market, and that reputation was Hector's achievement, built over years of careful work that resisted the shortcuts that impatience produces. He was also in the social dimension of the ranch's life, a man of genuine warmth and directness that made people feel at home immediately and completely. The Argentine manner is not the English manner. It does not approach through indirection or build toward warmth over the careful course of several meetings. It begins with warmth, offers it immediately, and expects it in return, and if it does not receive it, is genuinely puzzled rather than offended. Hector operated in this mode naturally, and the effect of his manner on the international visitors who came to El Pucara was consistently positive, even on those who came with the particular English guardedness that makes the Argentine manner initially alarming. Susan and Hector worked in a genuine partnership that was rare in their world. Many of the ranches that served the polo world were run by men whose wives were adjacent to the operation but not central to it. El Pucara was different. Susan was not adjacent to the ranch. She was part of it, bringing to the operation the knowledge and judgment that her lifetime with horses had produced, and the social intelligence that kept the international relationships functioning, and the reputation of the operation consistent in the world where reputation was the primary currency. Hector respected this not as a courtesy, but as a genuine recognition of what she brought. He was not a man with conventional views about what a wife should contribute to a marriage. He had chosen Susan precisely because she was the kind of woman who brought something substantial, and he valued what she brought with the specific appreciation of someone who knows what substance looks like because he has it himself and recognizes it when he finds it in someone else. Their life at El Pucara was not glamorous in the way that the British press occasionally described it. It was physically demanding, organized around early mornings and horses and the specific discipline that running a serious breeding and training operation requires. The glamour was real in the sense that the landscape was beautiful and the horses were beautiful, and the social life that the ranch generated brought interesting people from interesting worlds to their dinner table. But the glamour was secondary to the work, and both of them understood it that way. The daily rhythm of the ranch was organized around the horses' needs rather than the preferences of the people running it. Horses do not accommodate themselves to their owners' schedules. They require attention at times determined by their biology and their training requirements, and the seasonal demands of the polo calendar, which meant that Susan and Hector's days began early and were organized with the specific efficiency of people who have a great deal to accomplish before the sun moves far enough across the sky to make working outside unpleasant. Susan had learned early, rising in Buenos Aires, where the Anglo-Argentine community's morning routines were organized partly around the heat, which required outdoor activity to be accomplished before midday in the hotter months. The rhythm of El Pucara suited her in this respect as it suited her in others. She was not a woman who required late mornings or extensive preparation before engaging with the world. She got up, she worked, and the preparation, to the extent it was needed, was accomplished with a speed that reflected genuine indifference to the performance of getting ready. Hector cooked on the weekends, as Argentine men do, at the asado that was the social institution around which the ranch's communal life organized itself. The asado is not simply a barbecue. It is a ritual whose execution requires skill and patience and a relationship with fire and meat that is learned over years, and that is, in Argentine culture, one of the primary ways that men demonstrate seriousness. Hector's asados drew people from neighboring ranches and from the polo world and from the broader Argentine social world that El Pucara connected to, and they were, by all accounts, excellent. The food was a point of genuine pride, and the conversation around it was the conversation of people who were genuinely pleased to be together, which is the precondition for the kind of evening that people remember years later as one of the good ones. Susan presided over these occasions with the specific ease of someone who enjoys company without requiring it to be anything other than what it is. She was not a hostess who needed to manage the evening into particular shapes. She provided the conditions and let the gathering find its own level, and because the conditions were good, the level was usually high. People came to El Pucara and were glad they had come, and told other people to come, and the circle of people who had been there and wanted to return expanded over the years in the way of places where the hospitality is real. The illness and the vigil. Hector Barrantes was diagnosed with leukemia in 1992. The diagnosis arrived in the same year that Sarah's marriage was collapsing on the other side of the world, and the coincidence of timing concentrated in that single year two simultaneous crises of entirely different character that Susan had to navigate without the possibility of putting either one aside to deal with the other. Leukemia in 1992 was a condition whose treatment options had improved considerably from earlier decades, but remained limited in ways that treatments developed subsequently have changed. The prognosis varied with the specific form of the disease and the stage at which it was diagnosed, and the particular form that Hector had was not the most responsive to the treatments available. Susan understood this relatively quickly, with the directness about difficult facts that she had always brought to difficult facts. She did not allow hope to substitute for realism. She allowed both to coexist, which is the harder thing, requiring as it does the maintenance of engagement with the present moment while carrying knowledge of what the present moment is leading toward. She cared for Hector at El Pucara through the period of his illness. The polo world came to her during this time in the way that communities do when one of their central figures is in trouble. People appeared, people helped. People sat with Hector and talked about horses and the game and the players and the matches that both of them had seen, because talking about the things that had defined a life was one of the ways of honoring that life while it was still being lived. Sarah came from Britain when she could. The relationship between mother and daughter during this period, with the separation and the divorce and the media attention occupying Sarah's life in England, while Hector's illness occupied Susan's life in Argentina, was conducted at the remove of distance and across telephone lines that both of them used with the frequency that the situation demanded. Sarah has described her mother during this period as someone who was, whatever the circumstances, present and clear and recognizably herself, which is what people who love us need us to be when everything is difficult. Hector Barrantes died in May 1995. He was 54 years old. The obituaries that appeared in the British press were brief, noting his polo career and his marriage to the Duchess of York's mother and not much else. The polo world gave him more, the specific acknowledgement of a community for one of its own, recognizing what he had contributed to the game and to the breeding and training of the horses that made the game possible at its highest level. Susan was 58 years old when Hector died. The grief was real and complete in the way that grief is when the person who has died has been the center of the life you have built together for 20 years. She had loved him in the way that the best marriages produce, not the romantic love of the beginning, which is real but not yet deep, but the love that comes from years of shared work and shared experience and the accumulated knowledge of another person that makes them, in the most literal sense, irreplaceable, because no one else will ever know you in exactly the combination of ways that this person knew you. She stayed at El Pucara. This is worth noting because it would have been entirely understandable if she had not. She was a widow in a country that was not the one she had grown up in. Her daughters were in England. Her grandchildren were in England. The social world of her earlier life was in England. She could have returned. She could have sold the ranch and come back to Hampshire and spent her remaining years close to her family and familiar ground. She stayed because El Pucara was her home. Not the home she had been born into, or the home her first marriage had given her, but the home she had chosen with the full awareness of an adult who understood what choosing meant. The life she and Hector had built there was the life she had decided to live, and she was not going to abandon it simply because the person she had lived it with was gone. The horses needed tending, the operation needed running, the relationships with the polo world that they had built together needed maintaining, and Susan was not, had never been, someone who walked away from the things she had committed to. The grandmother. Susan Barrantes became a grandmother through Sarah and Andrew's marriage. Beatrice was born in August 1988, Eugenie in March 1990. The grandmother relationship that Susan built with these girls was shaped, as everything in her life with her daughters had been shaped, by the specific constraints of distance. She was not the grandmother who appeared at school plays and birthday parties and the ordinary occasions of childhood. She was the grandmother who came from Argentina, whose visits therefore had the quality of events, of concentrated presence that compensated through intensity for what it could not supply through regularity. Beatrice and Eugenie grew up knowing Alpucará as a place of adventure, the ranch in Argentina where the horses were magnificent and their grandmother was in her element, and everything smelled like grass and leather and the specific outdoor air of the pampas. Sarah has described the visits to Alpucará in terms that suggest they were among the more vivid experiences of her daughters' childhoods, not because they were grand or expensive, but because they were completely genuine. Susan at Alpucará was Susan entirely herself, not managing the impression she was making, but simply living in the way she lived, and children respond to that quality of authenticity with a directness that adults learn to suppress. The visits also served a practical purpose that went beyond the simple pleasure of grandmother and grandchildren spending time together. Alpucará was, as noted earlier, a place beyond the reach of the British tabloid press in a way that made it a genuine refuge. Beatrice and Eugenie could be themselves at the ranch in Argentina without anyone watching and writing it down. They could make the kind of mistakes that children make and be silly in the ways that children are silly, and have the experiences that form character rather than the experiences that form coverage, without any of it becoming material for someone's newspaper column. Susan was entirely deliberate about this. She had watched what the press attention had done to Sarah, how it had made the natural imperfections of a public life into permanent indictments, how it had taken the ordinary difficulties of a marriage and a young woman finding her way in a complicated institution and turned them into a narrative of failure that was both unfair and indelible. She was not going to allow her granddaughters to be formed by the same attention if she could prevent it, and in the context of Alpucará, she could prevent it completely. The horses were central to the grandmother relationship, as they were central to everything in Susan's life. She put her granddaughters on horses. She taught them the Argentine approach to riding, which is less formal than the British approach and more focused on the physical relationship between rider and horse than on the correct execution of technique. Beatrice and Eugenie developed, through their visits to Alpucará and through the riding they did in England, the physical confidence with horses that their mother had and their grandmother had before that. The chain of horses women running back through Susan to the Buenos Aires of the 1940s, where a girl learned to ride because not riding was not a serious option. Philip's relationship with Beatrice and Eugenie was, as a grandfather's relationship with his son's children necessarily is, important and shaped by the specific context of the royal family in which it operated. He was a man who genuinely loved his grandchildren, whose manner with them was warmer and less guarded than his manner with the adult world, because children did not require management in the way that the adult world required management, and he could be more fully himself with them than he could be in the more formal dimensions of his life. Susan's relationship with the girls was different in character, more adventurous, more physically organized, more Argentine in the specific sense of being organized around outdoor life and the physical world, rather than the indoor formality that the royal world required of everyone within it. The two grandparental relationships were complementary in ways that neither Philip nor Susan would ever have articulated. The girls experienced them as simply the different textures of two different people who loved them, which is the most important fact about them and the only one that ultimately mattered. What Ronald made of all of it. Ronald Ferguson, watching all of this from Dummerdown Farm and from the polo grounds where his professional life continued to take him, occupied a position of peculiar vantage. He had known Susan for most of his adult life. He had watched her become, through the marriage to Hector and the years at Alpucará, genuinely happy in a way that he understood, with the honesty that decent people manage about their failures, had not been fully available in their marriage. He had watched his daughter become a royal duchess, and then watched the institution the marriage connected her to become a source of considerable pain. Ronald's own story in this period is worth a genuine accounting because it illuminates by contrast something about Susan's way of handling public difficulty. Ronald was not discreet in the way that Susan was discreet. He was a warmer, more outward personality, someone whose instinct was always toward connection and engagement rather than toward the particular composure that Susan maintained as a matter of principle. When the press came for him, he did not have the armor of withdrawal that Susan possessed. The coverage he received in the late 1980s and early 1990s was damaging. Stories appeared about visits to a massage parlor in Wigmore Street in 1988, reported in the British press with the thoroughness that such stories receive when the subject is connected to the royal family. Ronald was at that point still serving as Philip's polo manager, and the proximity to the royal establishment made the story considerably more prominent than it would otherwise have been. He resigned from the polo management role. The resignation was a public acknowledgement of the difficulty the coverage had created, and it was the end of the professional relationship that had been the foundation of his life's work for nearly 3 decades. Philip's response to the situation was characteristic. He accepted the resignation as protocol required, acknowledged it without drama, and maintained in private the personal respect for Ronald that the professional relationship had generated, and that its end did not dissolve. The polo world is small enough that men who have worked together closely for 30 years do not become strangers simply because the formal arrangement that organized their working relationship has ended. Ronald remarried to a woman named Mary Greenall and rebuilt his life with the resilience that people who have come through public difficulty and survived it with their fundamental character intact are able to do. He continued to be involved in polo. He continued to be a father to his daughters and a grandfather to their children. He continued to be, in the limited but genuine way that ex-spouses who have built lives apart can be, someone in Susan's world, appearing at the family occasions that brought them together and managing those occasions with the practiced grace that divorced parents with shared children and grandchildren develop over years of practice. The relationship between Ronald and Susan after the divorce and the remarriage and the decades of separate lives was the civil relationship of 2 people who share children and who have decided that the children's well-being is more important than whatever resentments the history might justify. They were not friends in any sustained sense. They were also not enemies. At events that brought them together through their daughters' lives, they managed with the practiced grace of people who understand that the performances required of divorced parents at family occasions are among the more demanding performances that ordinary social life requires, and that performing them well is an act of love toward the children for whom they are being performed. The years before the end, Susan Barrantes in the mid-1990s was a woman who had outlasted or was in the process of outlasting several of the structures that had organized her life. Her first marriage was a memory. Her second husband was gone. Her connection to the British royal family through her daughter's marriage was in the process of being renegotiated as the divorce proceeded. The public identity that had accrued to her as the Duchess of York's mother, never entirely welcome, was shifting in unpredictable ways as Sarah's post-royal life took shape. What remained was El Pucará. The ranch was the stable fact of her life in a period when other facts were changing. The place whose demands were constant and whose rewards were genuine and whose connection to the physical world that had always been her primary world kept her grounded in something real when the social world around her was in flux. She managed the operation alone now, or as alone as anyone manages a ranch of that scale, which is to say with the help of the people whose employment had always been part of its daily functioning, but without the partnership at the center that had made the management something shared rather than solely borne. This shift was real and it required genuine adaptation. She had always been capable of managing the ranch's operations. She had been doing it alongside Hector for 20 years, and she knew every dimension of the work. But knowing how to do a thing and doing it as the sole responsible party are different experiences, and she made the transition between them with the focused attention that transitions of that magnitude require. The breeding program continued. She knew enough about the horses and the bloodlines and the buyers in the polo world to maintain it at the level that Hector had established, and she had relationships in the polo world that were her own, and that the absence of Hector did not dissolve. Buyers who had purchased horses from El Pucará continued to come back. The reputation that the ranch had built survived the death of the man most associated with it, because the quality that underpinned the reputation was still there, maintained by a woman who understood that quality as thoroughly as the man who had built it. The social life of the ranch also continued. Susan had never been someone whose entertaining capacity was derived from Hector's personality rather than her own. The ranch continued to draw the polo world and the broader social world that the polo world connected to, and Susan continued to host with the ease that genuine hospitality looks like when it is not performed. She was, if anything, more fully herself as the host of El Pucara after Hector's death than she had been during the years of their partnership, because the need to manage the impression she was making on visitors was now organized entirely around her own personality rather than around the combined personality of a couple. She came to Britain regularly in this period, pulled by the requirements of being a present mother to Sarah through the difficulties of the separation and the divorce and the complicated aftermath. The visits were more frequent than they had been during the height of the El Pucara partnership, because the partnership had imposed its own competing demands on her time in Argentina that were now less pressing than they had been. She had more freedom to travel, which was not compensation for Hector's absence but was a practical consequence of it. She was photographed at various events during these British visits, and the photographs from this period show a woman who had not diminished in the years since her most prominent royal adjacent appearances. She was in her late 50s, and she carried herself with the physical assurance of someone whose relationship with her own body had always been too practical to be disrupted by the considerations of age that preoccupy people whose primary self-understanding is organized around appearance. She looked like herself. She had always looked like herself. This is rarer than it sounds in a world where the people around her were often managing their presentation with considerable effort. Philip moved through this period with the steady continuity that had always characterized him. He was in his mid to late 70s, still physically active to a degree that was remarkable for his age, still engaged with the polo world through the relationships he had built across decades, even as his own playing days had ended, still present in the public life of the institution, with a consistency that never seemed to require effort because it had long since become simply what he was. His connection to Susan was part of the fabric of his social world, present without being prominent, maintained without being maintained because the maintenance was built into the world they both continued to inhabit. New Year's Eve, 1997. Susan Barrantes spent New Year's Eve of 1997 in the manner of someone who lived at a ranch in the Argentine province of Buenos Aires, which is to say at a party, probably the kind of party that the local world generates in that specific region on that specific night, outdoors or in a large indoor space designed to contain the particular energy of Argentine celebration, with the music that Argentine celebration requires, and the food and the wine and the specific joy of people who have made it through another year in a world that has not been particularly easy, and who are going to mark that fact with appropriate enthusiasm. Susan was 60 years old. She was in good health by all available accounts. She was, in the way of people who have spent their lives in physical work and physical activity, someone whose body had absorbed 60 years of outdoor life with the robustness that outdoor life tends to produce in the people who commit to it completely. She was not someone who had been declining. She was someone who was living her life with the same focused engagement she had always brought to it, in the place she had chosen, doing the work she had chosen, in the world that she had, over decades, made entirely her own. The accident happened in the first hours of January 1st, 1998. She was traveling in a car on a road near El Pucara when the car collided with a truck. The details of the accident as they have been reported are limited and sparse, the kind of account that emerges when something happens at a time and place where there are few witnesses, and where the investigation that follows is conducted in a language and a legal system that the British press was not well equipped to follow closely. What is known is that the collision was severe and that Susan did not survive it. She was 60 years old. The age deserves repeating, not because 60 is young in any absolute sense, but because 60 is not old enough, and Susan was not someone who was done with her life when her life ended. She had grandchildren who were 9 and 7. She had a ranch to run and horses to breed, and a polo world to remain part of, and a social life that was full and genuine and extending forward. The accident was not the end of a long decline. It was the end of a life that was still fully in progress. Sarah received the news in Britain. Beatrice was 9. Eugenie was 7. The specific quality of the grief that the news produced in people who loved Susan, grief for someone who has died suddenly and violently in the first hours of a new year, carries a particular quality of unreality that the more gradual losses do not have. There is no preparation. There is no time to accumulate the knowledge that the person is leaving so that when they are gone, the absence has at least been partly absorbed in advance. There is simply the present moment in which the person exists, and then the present moment in which they do not. The funeral and what it meant. The arrangements for Susan's funeral brought her back to England because she was buried at Dummer Churchyard in Hampshire, close to the house she had shared with Ronald and the countryside she had grown up riding through in the years of her first marriage. The decision to bring her back to England rather than bury her at El Pucará or in Buenos Aires was in its way a statement about the full geography of her life, about the multiple places and worlds and identities that she had inhabited and that all in the end claimed her. Sarah flew from Britain to Argentina to accompany her mother's body home. The journey involved the logistical complexity of international repatriation of remains, which is considerable, and the personal complexity of a daughter accompanying her mother across the ocean that had always separated them, which is something else entirely. Sarah has not spoken in detail about those days. The privacy she has maintained around the immediate aftermath of Susan's death suggests that the experience was one she has kept for herself, as she is entitled to do. The funeral at Dummer was attended by the people who had known Susan across the different chapters of her life. People from the polo world, in which she had spent so much of her adult life. People from the Hampshire social world of her first marriage. The neighbors and friends and the general community of country life that had known her as the wife of Ronald Ferguson before she was anything else to the public world. People from the Argentine community in Britain, which maintains itself in the way of immigrant communities, with the particular closeness of people far from home. Ronald was there. Sarah and Jane were there. The grandchildren were there. Philip was not there. The protocol that governs the public appearances of senior members of the royal family does not readily accommodate attendance at the funerals of people outside the royal family, however long-standing and genuine the connection might be. The absence was not unexpected, and was not the statement of indifference that a tabloid press looking for a story might have chosen to characterize it as. It was the constraint of a position that imposed its own logic on the movements and appearances of the person occupying it, and Philip had spent his life operating within those constraints without complaint. What Philip did in private around the time of Susan's death is not something the historical record documents. He was not a man who made public gestures of grief. He was not a man who expressed publicly what he felt about the deaths of people he had known for decades. He was a man who felt things. There is no question about that in the accounts of people who knew him well and who expressed those feelings in the private rather than the public register, through the choices he made and the way he continued to behave, rather than through any performed display of emotion. The polo world acknowledged Susan's death in the ways that the polo world acknowledges the deaths of people who have been central to it. Quietly, specifically, in the language of a community that knows what it has lost because it knows what the person contributed to the life of the community. She had been in this world since she was a teenager in Buenos Aires. She had maintained her place in it across 6 decades and 2 continents and 2 marriages and all the changes that 60 years of living produces. Her departure from it left a gap of a specific shape that the community recognized as the shape of Susan. What Beatrice and Eugenie carry. Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie are the living continuation of Susan's story. They were 9 and 7 when she died, old enough to have memories of her that are real and their own rather than constructed from other people's accounts, young enough that the memories are incomplete, and that the grandmother they know as adults is the grandmother assembled from those incomplete memories, and from everything that Susan's daughters have been able to give them of who she was. Beatrice has spoken about her grandmother in terms that are affectionate and carry the specific quality of someone speaking about a person they knew imperfectly but genuinely. The grandmother who arrived from Argentina with the outdoor air still on her, and the horses in her conversation, and the particular physical assurance of someone who belongs in the world she lives in, was a vivid figure in even the brief encounters that distance allowed. Children remember vividness. They carry it into adult life as the distilled essence of the person, sometimes more accurately than the full complex picture that adult relationships produce. Eugenie has developed in her adult public life a commitment to humanitarian work and to the kind of public advocacy that her grandmother's generation of women in her social world rarely engaged in publicly. The anti-slavery charity she supports reflects a seriousness about injustice that is worth noting in a family whose public life is often discussed primarily in terms of its ceremonial functions. Whether this reflects something of Susan's directness, her willingness to engage with the world as it actually is, rather than as convention would prefer it to be, is a connection that cannot be proven but is worth considering. Both girls grew up navigating the specific complexity of being minor royals whose parents' very public marriage difficulties had made them subjects of press attention from a young age. They have both managed this with a grace that reflects, among other things, the quality of the parenting they received from Sarah and from the various grandparental figures who contributed to their formation. Susan was part of that formation, in the limited but real way that someone who dies when you are 9 and 7 can be part of it. What Susan would have made of her granddaughters as the women they have become is one of the more appealing speculative questions in this story. She was someone who respected ability and directness and the willingness to live in accordance with genuine conviction rather than social expectation. She would have found things to admire in both of them. She would also, being Susan, have had opinions about specific choices and would not have kept those opinions to herself when asked, which her granddaughters, being their mother's daughters, would have been perfectly capable of receiving and arguing with. Philip in the years after. Philip lived until April 9, 2021, dying at Windsor Castle at the age of 99. He outlived Susan by 23 years, which means that he lived through the full arc of what came after: the reconstruction of Sarah's public life after the divorce, the growth of Beatrice and Eugenie into adult women, the marriages of his grandchildren, the extraordinary events of the early 21st century that no one in his world had been able to anticipate. He remained, through those years, someone whose connection to the polo world was part of his identity, even after his physical ability to participate in it had ended. The relationships he had built through the sport across 50 years did not end when the sport ended. They continued in the way that relationships built through genuine shared experience continue, maintained not through effort but through the simple fact of having been established so thoroughly that they persist without requiring maintenance. Susan was among the people he had known through that world, and her absence from it after 1998 was a specific absence in a life that accumulated specific absences as the years continued. Philip was someone who had been watching people he knew die for a very long time by the time Susan died. He had watched his own generation thin, and then the generation around him thin, and then people significantly younger than him begin to go. The deaths did not stop mattering because they had become frequent. They accumulated differently, with the particular quality of losses that mount in the later stages of a long life, each one adding to the weight without making the weight more bearable. What he retained, through the accumulation of losses, was the quality that had always defined him, the absolute consistency of being Philip in whatever circumstances he found himself in. He did not become philosophical in his old age in the performed way of people who adopt a pose of wisdom when wisdom becomes socially expected of them. He continued to be direct, interested, opinionated, physical to the degree his body allowed, and entirely himself. The people who interacted with him in his final years describe someone whose essential character had not changed since the earliest accounts of what he was like, which is either remarkable or simply what happens when someone has always been more comfortable being themselves than managing their presentation. The polo world that he and Susan had inhabited together across the years of their acquaintance continued after both of them were gone. The horses kept being bred and trained, the matches kept being played. The social life organized around the sport kept generating the combinations of friendship and rivalry and the particular companionship of shared physical passion that had been the connective tissue of their connection from the beginning. The world outlasted the people who loved it, as it always does, the revision the story needs. The standard account of the Ferguson family in royal history begins with Sarah's wedding in 1986 and ends with the divorce in 1996. It treats Susan Barrantes as a supporting character in her daughter's story, present at the significant events, photographed at the appropriate occasions, described in terms that emphasize the exotic quality of her Argentine life and the glamour of her appearance, without ever quite investigating what had put her in those photographs in the first place. This account is insufficient. It starts too late and looks too narrowly. It misses the 30 years of Susan's life before the wedding, the decades in which she was building the social position and the relationships and the reputation in the polo world that gave the wedding's context its depth. It misses the connection to Philip that predated Andrew by 30 years. It misses the polo world as the organizing structure of a set of relationships that ran from the 1950s through the 1990s, and that connected people who were not obviously connected in ways that the official version of events does not fully capture. To know that Susan Barrantes had been in Philip's social orbit for 30 years before her daughter married Philip's son is to understand that the royal wedding of 1986 was not Sarah Ferguson arriving from nowhere into a world that had no prior knowledge of her family. It was the formalization, in the most public and spectacular form available, of a connection that had existed in different form for a generation. The Ferguson family had been adjacent to the royal world through Ronald's professional relationship with Philip and through Susan's position in the polo and social world that Philip moved through, for decades before the wedding made that adjacency official and permanent. This does not make the romance of Andrew and Sarah less genuine. It does not make their connection less real or their marriage less their own. What it does is place the marriage in a longer history than the standard account provides, and it places Susan in that history as an actor rather than a backdrop. She was not incidental to the circumstances that produced the wedding. She was part of the fabric of those circumstances, woven in over decades in ways that were quiet precisely because that was how she operated. Quietly and with genuine effect. The revision that her story requires is not dramatic. It does not involve secret information or hidden agendas. It involves simply looking at a longer stretch of time than the tabloid narrative of the 1986 wedding allowed for, and recognizing that the social world that produced the marriage of Andrew and Sarah had been under construction for 30 years, and that Susan Barrantes had been one of its construction workers, showing up at the polo grounds and the garden parties and the social occasions that built the relationships that built the world. The horses again. If there is a single image that captures who Susan Barrantes actually was, it is probably not one of the photographs taken at Royal Ascot or Westminster Abbey or at any of the public events where she appeared as the glamorous Argentine mother of the Duchess of York. It is probably something more like the image of her at El Pucará in the early morning, before the visitors arrived and before the day's social requirements had imposed themselves, standing near the paddock with a horse in the specific posture of someone who has been around horses her entire life, and for whom their presence is not impressive or photogenic but simply correct. The horses were the through line of her life in the most literal sense. They connected the Anglo-Argentine childhood to the British officer's wife years, to the Argentine rancher years. They were the language she spoke most fluently, and the world in which she was most completely herself. They were the reason she was in the polo world that gave her access to Philip's circle. They were the reason El Pucará existed as a serious enterprise. They were the reason her daughters and granddaughters moved through the world with the physical confidence they carried. Philip loved horses with the same unglamorous commitment that Susan brought to them, not as aesthetics, not as status symbols, not as the accessories of a particular class identity, but as animals of genuine quality whose management and breeding and training were worth taking seriously as vocations. This shared quality, the practical seriousness about horses that both of them possessed, was probably the most genuine foundation of whatever connection existed between them across 40 years. It is less romantic than most accounts of royal adjacency and considerably more real. The polo world that contained both of them was at its core about the horses. The social life that organized itself around the sport was consequential and interesting, and the source of the relationships that shaped Susan's life. But it was the horses underneath all of it that made the sport worth organizing a social life around. Both Susan and Philip understood this in the specific way of people who love something genuinely rather than instrumentally, and that shared understanding was the ground on which everything else between them was built. The photograph revisited. There is a photograph taken somewhere in the mid-1950s at one of those garden parties that the British aristocracy staged with the precision of military operations and the casualness of people who had never once worried about the bill. A woman stands near the edge of the frame, dark-haired, Argentine, jaw-droppingly beautiful. She is laughing at something. The person she is laughing with is not fully visible. The woman is Susan Wright, not yet Ferguson, not yet Barrantes, still in the early years of the adult life she is building in a world that is not quite the one she was born into. She is 20 years old, or 22, or thereabouts. She has been in Britain for some time now, long enough that the social codes are familiar but not so long that they have become invisible. She is at an event in the polo world because the polo world is where she moves, because her husband is a polo player and a military officer, and because she is herself someone who rides well and who belongs in rooms like this one as much as anyone belongs anywhere. The person she is laughing with, the person whose face is not fully visible in the frame, is in the polo world too. He is one of the best amateur polo players in Britain at this point, a man who throws himself at physical challenges with an intensity that the more comfortable people around him sometimes find exhausting. He has been playing polo seriously for several years, and he is good at it, and he knows she knows the difference between good and excellent, and he has said something about a horse or a match or a shot he made last weekend, and she has said something back that was funny and exact. They are laughing. 40 years later, her daughter will marry his son, and the world will watch, and the world will write endlessly about what it means and whether it will last and who the woman in the mother of the bride outfit actually is. And the answer to that last question, the true answer, the one that requires all 40 years of context to give fully, is that she is the woman in the photograph, the one who earned her place in that garden through genuine ability and genuine character. The one who was already there, already known, already laughing with the people who would one day be connected to her by the most formal and public bond that two families can share. She was not a footnote. She was the opening chapter of a story that the world only started reading in 1986, long after she had already written most of it. And the chapter she wrote for herself, at a polo ranch in Argentina, with a man she loved and horses she understood, and a life she had chosen completely, was the best chapter of all, even if it was the one that nobody thought to look for. Susan Mary Wright Ferguson Barrantes. Born March 27, 1937 in Buenos Aires, died January 1, 1998, on a road in the province of Buenos Aires. The woman who knew Prince Philip before Andrew ever met Sarah. The woman who built a world in England and then built another one in Argentina, and who filled both of them with the kind of presence that people remember decades after the person is gone. The woman whose story deserves more than a footnote, and whose laughter in a photograph from the mid-1950s belongs to history as much as anything that came after. She was 60 years old, and she was not done, and the road was dark. And then it was the 1st of January, and she was gone, and the world she had been so completely part of continued without her in the way that worlds always do, carrying forward the things she had put into it, the horses and the children and the relationships and the particular quality of being genuinely fully present in whatever room she was in, which was the greatest thing she ever gave anyone, and which nobody who received it ever forgot. 3. Sarah after. The story of Susan Barrantes does not end with her death, because the people she shaped continued into the world, and the things they did in it carried her forward in ways she could not have planned and did not need to. The most visible of those people is Sarah, whose subsequent life has been by any measure one of the more extraordinary acts of public reconstruction in modern British life. Sarah Ferguson, in the years after the divorce, was one of the most written about women in Britain, and almost nothing written about her was charitable. The tabloid press had spent the years of the marriage building a narrative of excess and impropriety that had reached its peak in the photographs of 1992, and the post-divorce years were characterized by coverage that did not significantly soften, simply because the marriage it had been criticizing no longer existed. She had become a story of a particular type, the cautionary tale, the woman who had failed to properly inhabit the role the royal family had given her, and the press was not going to let go of that story simply because the story had moved on. What Susan had given Sarah for this period, among other things, was a model of how to absorb public difficulty without being defined by it. Susan had spent years being described in tabloid terms that were reductive and inaccurate, and had continued to be exactly herself throughout. She had not become the tabloid version of herself, had not allowed the external pressure of the coverage to reshape the internal reality of how she operated and what she valued. She had gone on being Susan, stubbornly and consistently, in the face of a press apparatus that preferred a simpler and less interesting version of her. Sarah went on being Sarah. The specific shape of her subsequent life, the children's books, the weight loss campaigns, and then the public rejection of them, the advocacy work, the businesses that succeeded and the ones that did not, the ongoing friendship with Andrew that defied every conventional expectation about how divorced couples manage their post-divorce relationships, the gradual rehabilitation of her public image from cautionary tale to something considerably more complex. All of this was Sarah's own work. She built it herself, with the physical confidence and social ease that her mother had put in her, and with the specific resilience of someone who has been knocked down comprehensively enough that getting up has become its own expertise. Susan would have watched all of this from El Pucará in the years she had. She would have had opinions. She would have expressed them on the phone and in person during the British visits, with the directness that she always brought to everything. She would not have been exclusively complimentary, because she was not an exclusively complimentary person, and Sarah knew it and relied on it. A mother who tells you only what you want to hear is a mother who is not actually paying attention, and Susan paid attention with a completeness that made her assessments both reliable and sometimes uncomfortable. Sarah valued them precisely because they were not managed for her benefit. The daughters that Susan raised had, between them, a combined resilience that is worth noticing. Jane built a quiet life and maintained it. Sarah built a complicated life and rebuilt it repeatedly when it fell apart. Both of these are forms of strength. Both of them had their origin, at least in part, in the example of a woman who had made her own choices and lived with them completely, who had crossed an ocean for a man and a ranch and a life she believed in, and who had stayed with that belief through the death of the man and the complications of the ranch and the distance from everything she had also loved. Susan Ferguson Barrantes demonstrated throughout her life that choices made with genuine conviction do not have to be reversed when they become difficult. They have to be honored, which is a different and harder thing. The long connection. There is a detail in the story of Susan and Philip that is easy to overlook but that deserves a moment's attention. When Philip died in April 2021, he had outlived Susan by 23 years. In those 23 years, the world had changed substantially. The polo career that had been the original basis of their connection was long over. The Ferguson marriage that had made the connection institutional was long over. Ronald Ferguson, who had been the professional link between Philip's polo life and Susan's domestic world, had also died in 2003 of prostate cancer at the age of 68. By the time Philip died, he had outlived nearly everyone who had been part of the polo world of the 1950s and 1960s. The world that had generated the connection to Susan, the players and the managers and the wives and the social infrastructure that had organized itself around the sport in the decades after the war, had largely passed. What remained were the institutions, the clubs, the championships, the breeding lines that traced back to horses purchased and trained in that era, and the memory, held by the dwindling number of people old enough to have been there, of what that world had been like when it was fully alive. Philip was among those who carried that memory. He had spent decades in the polo world, at its most vital, when the players were genuinely great, and the sport had a social centrality that it has since partially lost, and the people he had known within it were part of the texture of a world that he had inhabited more completely than almost any other. Susan was part of that texture, not the most prominent part, not the part that the official histories of his polo career would emphasize, but part of it specifically and genuinely in the way that all the people who make up a world are part of it, each contributing something specific and irreplaceable to the whole. Philip was not someone who sentimentalized the past. He was not given to nostalgia in the performed way of people who wear their memories as a kind of jewelry. But he was someone who carried his history with him as a matter of fact, as part of the full account of what he was and where he had been, and the people who had been in that history were part of what he carried. Susan was among them, in the specific and particular way that people who have known each other for decades in a shared world are among each other's history, present, specific, impossible to reduce to a category. The connection between them was not a great romance or a dramatic friendship or anything that the conventional vocabulary of significant relationships easily accommodates. It was the connection of two people who found each other in a world they both loved and who remained in each other's awareness across the decades of their separate lives. It was sustained by the smallness of the world that contained both of them, by the polo grounds and the social occasions and the family connection that the marriage of their children eventually created and formalized. It was not the most consequential relationship in either of their lives, but it was real, which in the end is more important than consequential. The world remembers Philip for many things, most of them considerably larger than his connection to the wife of his polo manager. The world remembers Susan for very little. This is the disproportion of fame, which operates according to its own logic and has no particular interest in justice or accuracy. What the record can do, if it looks at the full span of time rather than the truncated version that the tabloid narrative of the 1980s and 1990s provides, is give Susan Barrantes her proper place in the story, not as a footnote, not as a supporting character in her daughter's royal narrative. As a person of genuine substance who built real things in two different worlds across 60 years of living, and who connected those two worlds through a set of relationships that predated and outlasted the specific royal connection that is the only thing most people know her for. She was in the photograph before anyone had thought to look for her. She deserves to be seen in it now. A final note on sources and silence. The writing of a life like Susan Barrantes's runs into a specific problem that lives of more prominent people do not face in the same way. The primary sources are largely silent. Susan did not write a memoir. She did not give extended interviews about her own history, her own choices, her own inner life. She was photographed at events and described in newspaper coverage that was primarily interested in her connection to her daughter, and the newspaper coverage, for all its volume, contains very little of Susan herself as she actually was. What exists are the accounts of people who knew her, filtered through their own perspectives and interests and limitations. There is what Sarah has said in interviews and in her own writings, which is extensive but which reflects a daughter's view of a mother, shaped by love and by the specific complexity of their relationship across distance and divorce and reunion. There is what people in the polo world have said, which reflects the particular esteem of a community that is not given to public expression, but that has its own ways of marking what it values. There is the physical evidence of El Pucará and what it became under Susan and Hector's management, which speaks in the language of results rather than words. And there is the simple fact of what she did. She crossed an ocean for a marriage that suited her. She crossed it again for another one that suited her better. She built two lives on two continents and was fully present in both. She raised two daughters at distance and maintained her connection to them with the consistency of someone who understood that love, like horsemanship, is something you demonstrate through what you actually do rather than through what you claim to feel. She stayed at El Pucará after Hector died because it was her home and she was not leaving her home. She died at 60 in the first hours of a new year, on a road she had driven 100 times. The silences in the record are not failures of the record. They are in part the record. Susan Barrantes was a private person about the things that mattered most to her, and the privacy she maintained throughout her life is itself a fact about who she was. She did not require the public confirmation of her value. She knew what she had built and who she had loved and where she had been and what she had contributed to the worlds that contained her, and she did not need anyone to write it down to make it real. This account attempts, across the length and breadth of what it has covered, to write it down anyway. Not because Susan would have wanted it written down, but because the story of the polo world and the royal family and the 60 years of one woman's movement between Argentina and England deserves more than the footnote it has been given. And because the woman in the photograph, the one who is laughing at something that the person beside her has just said, deserves to be recognized as the person she was rather than the supporting character she has been made. She was 60 years old. The road was dark. The truck came from somewhere she was not expecting, and then it was 1998 and the world was going to have to do without her, which it has done, and which is its loss more than hers, because she had already had her life in full, and it had been, by any honest accounting, a remarkable one. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.